Hey, this is Chase at MADenomics, and I'm here today with Sean White, and we're going to be discussing inflation, and he's going to open with the definition.
The simple definition of inflation is going to be the increase in the amount of money in a currency system, which lowers the purchasing power of the money you have. This is called the inflation of money. This is not the inflation of the market value of goods, which is what most people would be talking about when they mention inflation. It is very basically a set number to offset a growth of population. To simply explain it, if you have an increase in population, you're going to need an increase in the amount of money circulating in a system to supply the financial needs of a population. And there's a lot of advantages that we can create through a system that is inflating. And so Chase is going to start you off.
So we do have quite a few beneficial aspects of inflation, and I know the word has kind of a negative connotation. People don't really like to hear the word, and we're inflating, but it's actually pretty good for the economy. It limits currency value, which people would kind of see as, that's a bad thing. Why would you want to limit how much our money's worth? But it actually keeps money in our system, because if our money was too valuable, we'd be able to take that money and spend it overseas and import more goods. And so that's actually a leakage from our current economic situation. And so having that occur would actually be a disadvantage for our local economy. It also increases savings. So we're going to save more money in our banks when inflation's really high. And also we get better interest rates because the banks are keeping in check with inflation. They're watching that number. And so the higher that number goes, the better interest rates we'll get because they're trying to compete in a competitive market.
When you look at inflation rates from the economy of a country, they're generally between 1 and 2%. Canada has had 1.9, 0.94, 1.52. Inflation rate is supposed to give control to a country. The inflation value of money, which is, as we explained before in the first video, set by the central banks, or in the United States, it's the Federal Reserve. This is where we are trying to gain control so that we don't have a system that can inflate rapidly. If you have a rapid inflation, you could get to situations of hyperinflation. This is when a central bank will print money at such a vast speed that the money becomes useless. It has no value, or the value that it has decreases so quickly, the buying power decreases so massively. You can get situations that happen famously between World War I and World II due to the appeasements that Germany had to pay from the war. Hyperinflation is never good. It's a rare situation, but it is not necessarily related to the inflation of money that we do from a economic basis on a yearly standard. Hyperinflation is when a government or the central bank loses control. They panic, don't know what to do, and they try to print money. When people talk about the concept of, if we need more money, let's just print money, that's one of the problems you can have. Hyperinflation is when you recklessly print money. So we want to inflate at a common level to encourage savings. If you didn't have inflation, there would be no advantage to an individual to put their money in the bank, nor would there be an advantage for them to spend their money. This might seem a bit negative in creating a system where they want you to spend all your money, but it encourages growth. It is very similar to having a tool around the house that you aren't using that you paid for. The value to you is only how often you actually use it. If you've bought a shovel and you never used the shovel, yes, you could have paid $20 for a shovel, but its effective use is meaningless. It was never used. It was a tool that didn't do work. Money's the same thing. Money only does work when it transfers person to person. When it is held, it's useless and it actually damages the economy. Inflation is very simple definition form, so we're going to jump right into the discussion now. And Chase, what are your thoughts on inflation? What are your issues with inflation? And if you had some control over how it was modeled, what would you do to change it?
Well, I believe inflation currently works in regards to being able to keep our money limited. I don't think it's a bad thing that you're keeping your money local and decreasing imports as much as possible, I suppose. Inflation, I believe, is working as intended just because having the banks limit the value of our currency will keep imports at a minimum. And so keeping trade local is a good way to keep your local economy stimulated, provides jobs for local people, and just feeds families, basically, when it comes down to it at the end of the day.
With how you're able to compare the inflation of one country to another, it doesn't necessarily mean that an import is bad, more namely on the purchasing of capital. So you may not be importing into your country, but the inflation won't necessarily stop the purchase of capital of nationals from one country to the other. Yeah.
Well, in relation to the inflation of a value of currency, specifically looking at Canada, when we use our inflation rate to increase the value of our currency, if it's increased too high, then we'll find that we'll be getting a lot of imports, and that's not necessarily good for the economy. With an inflation rate, I think on average they shoot for around 2.0. But with that in mind, it keeps trade local, and so we'll have less imports and more money staying in and circulating through our system. So we'll have more jobs created locally, there'll be more spending locally, so that just increases the cash flow in our local society. So with inflation, another key point is it actually guards against having deflation. So that would be the reduction in the cost of goods and services. If I go out and deliver the newspaper every day, instead of getting paid $5 to deliver that paper, I'll be paid $3 if we're in a deflating economy. And so it keeps our current services at a consistent level, which I believe is another benefit of inflation.
If you were in a situation where your wage could decrease fairly, where a business would say, since there was deflation in the economy, I'm giving you a wage decrease in a ratio to that deflation. You live in a situation where people might not buy houses because if they know it's deflating 1 or 2% per year for the last few years, they're going to wait longer to see how much the market value of these objects deflate before they choose to purchase. And this happens in current housing economy. But when you talk about it as a global or a national scale of deflation, when it's happening to all goods and services, people are saying, well, my money is becoming worth more. So the longer I wait, the more money I inherently gain by doing nothing. This causes a stagnance in purchase. This causes the economic system to slow down and in the worst case scenarios to stop. It seems callous, as we mention often, to want to continue to buy, but it is the heartbeat of an economic system. It's the movement of money. And blood is great, but when blood doesn't move, it's not very good for you.
Increasing the savings is always good too, because people always need like a rainy day fund. And so having money that you have saved for any incident in the case that you need it, it's always a good thing to have. I know you were stating earlier that money is kind of useless when it's not in motion, but there are those situations and times where you need to have a little bit of a fund in case you can't work or you can't do anything.
Though I stated it before that money is only useful in motion. If your savings are in a bank, the bank is able to put that money into motion while at the same time securing that you have it. That is why, if you want to look at it from a theory perspective, you should always have your money in the bank because it is good for the economy. And when we talk about what is good for the economy, we are also talking what's good for anybody under the economy. This is not to use the term the trickle-down theory of, the rich get richer or terms like that. It is when the economy is stronger, the purchasing power of your money is stronger. Which might seem odd because when we were discussing about inflation, we said that it was a decrease in the purchasing power. But that decrease in purchasing power and that regulation and stability of our economy will be in comparison to other countries if our economic policies are stronger, if we have a higher confidence in our country, will increase relative to other countries. And that creates a larger purchasing power.
Well, it's also how we were discussing earlier about the market price. And so when we're going through a phase of inflation, a lot of companies will jump on that and rather keeping regulation and say we get a 2% inflation, instead of them just inflating 2%, they'll inflate 2.5%, they'll inflate up to 3%. They'll try and squeeze that little bit of revenue extra out of you during a phase of inflation because of the ambiguity.
And that's where you talk about the market value inflation. How most people use the term. The market value inflation of the product is simply how much did it increase over time. And if you were to compare various basic goods, you would notice that they are significantly above 2%. Unfortunately, inflation isn't inherently used properly. Another issue with it is wages. Under the notion that inflation exists, when you work at a company, every year you should be getting a raise in ratio to the inflation. However, that's not actually a raise. That is you getting paid the same amount based on the economic standards of the country, which means if you don't get a pay increase, you are actually being paid less for your services. If you get a raise that's less than the rate of inflation, or if you get a raise that is equal to the inflation, that's not a raise. A raise is only if you get paid more than the rate of inflation per annum.
I believe that's probably one of the more important points that we're going to bring up in the show today, because you're right, not everybody, sure, you get your 75-cent pay increase, but if inflation's 2%, you're not even covered. So what's the point?
But inflation is abused, unfortunately, when you talk about larger scales of business, though I can't personally speak to how intentional it is. When you look at people in standings, even if they own a lot of capital, if they own a lot of resources, how much is ignorance of the employees need to be compensated through inflation, and how much is calculated abuse of the employee force. These are standards that we need to take a look into government regulations to it. When you discuss about a minimum wage increase, it would be very annoying and cumbersome to change the minimum wage every year, to change all the policies. When we change them, it's to compensate for the inflation over a period of time. That's why we increase minimum wage. It's not because we generally feel that people deserve more money for no apparent reason, or that a economic system has feelings and believe people should deserve more money. Inflation is based off the market value of a standard of living and how much a person in theory needs to meet those standards. However, anyone living in the minimum wage situation knows there needs to be a lot more detailed research into exactly what that means. But I think going into minimum wage is going to be a bit too much of the scope for today's episode. There's a lot I want to talk. There's a lot Chase wants to talk about. I personally want to know if you thought of anything that could be better than an inflation model within reason. Is it something that we don't really have an alternative for, even though it has, unlike fiat currency systems, I don't feel that the weaknesses of a fiat currency offset the advantages to a fiat currency. I think a fiat currency realistically is probably the best form that we can have. Might be a naive comment, but as of now, I don't know of a better one. Inflation, there's very obvious issues, and I was wondering if you had any ideas to offset any of those issues rather than just saying, these are some issues, move on.
Really, there aren't any issues if everybody plays fair, right? If everybody's playing by the books and can take into account that when they give you a 75-cent raise, it's actually not a raise. And when they have clear intent behind what they're actually doing, if everybody was using the inflation rate and using it to guide their actions, I don't think there'd be too much of a problem with it, really.
I do understand what you're saying, but I feel it's morally nice to say it should work. And if everyone plays by the rules, it would be great for everyone. But we live in a society where people intentionally break the rules. We do live in a society where there are people, whether a small group or a large group, that tries to bend or even break the rules when they know they can get away with it. Especially since the inflation of wage isn't a rule. It's a theory that people should have, but there is no way, it is not governed in any way, it is not imposed on any business. So that aspect of it is there in theory, but there's no backing of it, there's no support.
So I think that's all we have time for today. If you have any further questions, you can reach us at cs.mutuallyassureddiscussion@gmail.com, or feel free to send us a tweet at cs.mad. Or if you have any other further questions, you can always leave us a comment in the comment section below. Alright, Sean, sign us off.
Let's get this done.